Good morning, David.
Yeah.
We talked about the inappropriate adults.
Oh, yeah.
And now was first part, and now we can talk about
Yeah.
appropriate adults.
Yeah, you wanted me to, I think, start with who I thought the appropriate adults in the room was, but I start with the inappropriate ones. Probably because it's easier to remember the more infamous people in our planet than the good people. I suppose if you talk about appropriate adults, you've got to approach the question why they are appropriate. And I approach that in several different ways. The first way, I suppose, of approaching it is Chomsky defined the most evil organization in human history as the Republican Party of America. He calls it the triad of evil, and I agree with them. And that is because they represent three awful things: extreme religious fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, but it's also Catholic fundamentalism or Islamic fundamentalism. But they are, unlike Islamic jihadists, very powerful, because the second aspect of the triad of evil is the neoliberalism, the amount of money that they have, the amount of money that they spend for nefarious purposes. And the third aspect is this creeping relativism post-truth. So much of the appropriate adults in the room, therefore, are those that commit themselves at some level to telling the truth about situations, who are not exclusively motivated by money. I mean, there's a continuum, I think, between what Posner, the judge in America, calls homo economicus, which a lot of people define, which is someone who's exclusively motivated by wealth maximization, and in the other extreme, homo eroticus, which is obviously hedonism behavior. And what, of course, is needed are people who are in the moderate center, and that's increasingly being squeezed out. People who are not exclusively motivated by libidinous pleasure, but equally not exclusively motivated by money, or the two may merge into one another. Alain Badiou, who's a French structuralist, normally out of contempt, but he's very interesting kind of Marxist. He also has an interesting bifurcation which feeds into the notion of appropriate or inappropriate. He says, in effect, appropriateness are people who are committed to values like political engagement or engagement as commitment to social justice, whatever that concept means, or towards the formulation of a just society on one level, who are believers in, who are not exclusively consumerist motivated, who are not exclusively committed to the capitalist order. Being a Marxist, of course, he's completely anti-capitalist in every sense of the term, and anti this concept of order and indeed family values. Now, I've given out about family values as well, and it's not, of course, that I don't believe in families, but the point about family values is the focus on self and a narrow spectrum of people around you, often imbued with extreme religiosity, to put yourself in a silo bubble so you don't engage in real important issues affecting you and the planet, like poverty, social exclusion, environmental destitution. So if we have that framework of, within that spectrum of considerations, what is good and what is not good, and what is an appropriate adult on that basis, I've come up with some, I think, very unconventional choices. The first is the Queen of England as an appropriate adult. Now, there are many reasons why that is the case, since we're here. One is, of course, that the Queen of England has vast experience. By virtue of being a dynastic monarch and in charge for so long, she's met everybody, knows everybody. And whatever, I'm not saying she's obviously a very bright woman, but whatever level of intelligence she had initially has been developed exponentially in terms of the people that she's met, and judgment has kicked in on that basis. And mostly, she speaks nothing but common sense, and correct common sense, about moderation, anti-extremism, environmental protection, an inclusive world order, anti-racism, and the need for moderation and balance. And some of the prejudices she's historically had are towards people she just thinks are a bit too much. You know, crusaders, demagogues, fascists, overly bland people. And so I think the Queen of England, but it is another aspect of that. It's because neoliberalism creates short-term contracts feelings of disposability. You can't get rid of a monarch who's been there for that period of time. So she doesn't have a short-term agenda or a short-term mindset, and she knows everybody and knows everything. Now, she's obviously subject to institutional constraints. The second appropriate adult, since we're in England, but he's here as well, although I've never met him, is the greatest living Irishman. He's a competition that was run a number of years ago in Britain called the greatest living Englishman. And I think they ultimately voted Churchill ahead of William Shakespeare, or greatest Englishman of all time. And the Irish have always had this kind of joke concept of the greatest living Irishman. But I don't think there's any question who the greatest living Irish person is, and that's a hippie, ex-punk rocker from Dunleary, aging hippie called Sir Bob Geldof. And the reason is very straightforward. I mean, he blends so many things. His career has been one of continuous activism for the good. And in a very complex world, it has been an attempt at proper wealth redistribution where governmental structures would not provide it. The utilisation of charity in a very effective way, which is why Margaret Thatcher liked him so much. Getting major rock stars to take money from consumers who buy too many of their records and CDs for the purpose of alleviating at some structural level world poverty. And he's done it several times, as well as all of his other campaigning efforts. And it's a very interesting example because, of course, to a certain Dublin middle-class mindset, he's a renegade in a way because he's not, he's a rock star and he's not a proper bourgeois person, he's not establishment. What have they done except muck things up completely? What has he done? A hell of a lot. And, of course, in this, the need for creative solutions to world problems is also a systemic feature of his career as well. The third person is I've chosen is Noam Chomsky, and I've written about Chomsky. I wrote an article in Cassandra Voice about him. I've written about him on several given occasions. I nearly met him, but I didn't. When I was at Harvard, I trekked up to his office, which is in a back street near Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It was like a little rabbit warren. I wasn't there. And tried, I think, banged on the door and a few other things. But I have been in communication with his, I think, wife or assistant, and I've sent him some stuff I've written about him. And I'm a huge admirer because he has pushed himself into a position of impregnable tenure in a university-driven culture where this wouldn't happen again, because they'd filter out all the liberals well before now, and all the people who are prepared to buck the system. And in a sense, he got there, it was said initially, because he came up with this linguistic theory of a common language, which was of commercial interest to the Pentagon, in terms of creating some sort of common business speak or common monitoring language. And the result of that was that he was of interest to them, and what he has become, therefore, is, in effect, the establishment radical. And the importance of his establishment radicalism is the belief, he's been a huge critic of American foreign policy in South America, in Chile, in Indonesia, but he's also been someone who's shown a terrific commitment to the truth and to the way, even at an early stage, how consent, borrowing a term I think from Walter Benjamin and others, is manufactured in what might be called a spectator democracy, how our choices are manipulated and influenced by mass media, how the truth is never revealed, and how the powerful do not put the lenses on themselves and do not accept responsibility for their actions. And that process has accentuated. It's not evil if we do it. We're not responsible if we're in error. And Chomsky's commitment to try and disentangling fact from fiction and focusing on rigor and accuracy is a huge contribution. And he's been fearless. But the point is, even though he's been fearless, the question becomes, is there anybody who's going to occupy that position in the future within the American establishment? I doubt it. Or within almost any establishment. And of course that leads to the notion that the whole concept of the public intellectual is a generational thing in decline. It might be episodic, but I feel it's almost gone down a particular hole. The fourth person I've chosen is also a public intellectual. He's a professor, I think, in London now. And it's very odd that a mad Slovenian Marxist, who when he communicates has spittle coming down his face, and has done these terrific, almost comedic films, A Pervert's Guide to Cinema and A Pervert's Guide to Ideology. He doesn't mean pervert, dumbed down universe in the sense of pervert. He means pervert in someone who subverts. Has become so famous, and that's Mr. Zizek. Now, I must say, initially I read all of his initial books with, Chomsky's prejudice against the postmodernists, which is this is gibberish, and it's nonsense, and it doesn't make any sense. But I wouldn't say he's dumbed down, he's watered down the message, and in his more recent books, he's become much more accessible to a mass audience in terms of making very significant points about. He's always made significant points about ideology and how the Marxist term, how everybody's being duped, but increasingly people are being consumer duped all of the time, and he calls it ideological misidentification. No one believes anything politicians or advertisers say anymore, but nonetheless they vote against their interests. I mean, that was the kind of bizarre thing about the Trump election. There's no way somebody reflective in blue-collar America could legitimately have thought that any of them were going to do anything for housing, healthcare, or any of the real issues that they affect, but they still voted for it. So it's almost like the ideology has become internalized. The other thing that is very interesting, a lot of the Marxists are like this now as they've grown up. They're becoming very conscious of the valuelessness nature of the universe, and they're seeking to put a united front up against nihilistic behavior, because the kind of nihilism that is evident in some of the activities of the far right and extremists are frightening to everybody. And therefore they're not quite embracing the Enlightenment again, but they're certainly moving towards a position where people have to disentangle fact from fiction, where they have to focus on degrees of reason and rationality, and where there has to be some suggestion of groups who are towards the middle, the centre, banding together, if not a united front, at least in a sense of outcry about all the awfulness that surrounds us at the moment. Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, has become fashionable again because of his concept of hegemony, which was always the idea that the middle and working classes should band together in a cultural sense. I think that idea has come right back into fashion since the world is now a serf world, a medieval world, where the concept of middle class is eroded to the point of oblivion. And it's 1% of humanity or less controlling all of the assets and everybody else in the same boat. And so Zizek has become, therefore, through his writings and ideology, through his perception of truth and propaganda, and more interested, I think, in actually reaching an audience where he can influence people about what's really going on. So enough of intellectuals for the moment then. And five, let me pick a completely aberrant choice for the hell of it. Homer Simpson. Now Homer Simpson is a real person, as we all know. And he goes to Moe's Tavern and he goes drinking every evening. And his wife is Marge and his son is a brat called Bart Simpson. And he's been with us so long he must be a real person. He's not a creature of fiction anymore. He's a cultural cipher, to adopt Roland Barthes' term in this particular context. And Homer Simpson, I think, is important because of the emphasis on idleness. He's a lazy human being. Now, I don't condone idleness intrinsically, but I equally believe that work should be purposeful and meaningful, and one should not overwork oneself. And one of the problems in our very frantic world is people don't pause. Silence, contemplation, reflection, do nothing. sometimes that's a rejuvenative force in itself. And what is wrong with a nice idle slob as opposed to a go-getting dynamic psychopath? So I think Homer Simpson says a lot about the planet. This feeds into Mr. Varoufakis, because of course from the perspective of the Germans and the bureaucracy, the Greeks are an idle race, and indeed so are the Irish, and anyone who owes the Germans money is idle. And their children, really. I mean, the whole concept of the appropriate, inappropriate adults came from Lagarde's ridiculous remark to Varoufakis about adults in the room. These people are not adults. Lagarde, Merkel, a lot of them, they're inappropriate adults if they are adults. They're politicians, they're bureaucrats. They're the spongers in the system, not the Greek people. The spongers, I mean, this whole concept of welfare dependence. Yes, there are welfare dependent people, of course, but equally welfare dependents are Goldman Sachs, bankers, the gravy train bureaucrats, and the people who've screwed everything up for the last 30 years and are calling a very educated economist and writer who was democratically elected, albeit as a communist. And of course, the other thing about that, I think that's very important, is that it shows that real power no longer resides in education or the democratic mandate, which doesn't exist. And just as I did a broadcast about Ireland, which you asked me to do, where they've even aborted the process earlier, you can't elect a populist socialist state. It's just not going to happen. And if Varoufakis speaks truth to power and exposes all of them, people read his books with interest, but it doesn't change anything. This leads to Mr. Bernie Sanders. Now, obviously, this is a miracle in a way. An aging, rather unprepossessing, rather roughly articulate leader tapping into genuine populism as opposed to fake populism, by which I mean someone who is genuinely purporting to represent the interests of blue-collar, middle-class American is horrified at what's happened. And it looks like he will get the democratic mandate, absent some sex smear scandal or some such nonsense that they'll fabricate. They've probably had ample opportunity to do it, but their ingenuity is such you never know. However, he will not win. And it's the same with Mr. Varoufakis, because the whole neoliberal corporate monolith is not going to permit a democratic government which truly represents the interests of the people that they want to exploit and sponge. So a lot of my heroes, I think, tend to be Pyrrhic. They're saying the right things, they're doing the right things, but they're being stunted in the process of so doing. One person who might be so stunted, two people, I think, quickly, are Warren Buffett. Now, Buffett's getting a very bad rep. And there's Soros is what you meant to say. Soros gets a very bad rep. And Soros gets a bad rep because there's a lot of racism used against him as a Jewish financier. But he is at least, in a plutocratic way, exercising his plutocratic ability properly and responsibly by seeking to divest himself of his money and engage in proper levels of task for the reconstruction of the world and the planet. I think that's all the more threatening in a way, that there is some level of civic consciousness at that level. And of course it is people with those assets and wealth that need to step up to the mark, particularly those that have made them in unconventional ways, that they're not bought by governments or controlled by governments. So their assets are their assets, and they can do with them what they wish. And if those people, like him, start taking interest, there is some hope, because they have power, and people will listen to what they say. As they do, funnily enough, to a 16-year-old Swedish celebrity, Greta Thunberg. Now, I think what's most interesting, I've written about this, an article called Silent Night, but she suffers from Asperger's, and I do mildly as well. But one feature of it is a tendency to just call it as you see it and speak the truth, not prettify things with lies. And her book and her utterances have the crystal clarity of unadorned accuracy. The house is on fire. You're doing nothing. It's all falling apart. What future is there for me, or children, or young people, when you've messed it up? She's right. And yet they're patronising, of course, as they will, because she's a child, I suppose, but that doesn't detract. In a way, the novelty factor of her being like that. I mean, I drew the analogy to her. I don't mean to be unfair, but Gunter Grass's great book, one of the great books of all time, The Tin Drum, has Oscar, the handicapped child, I'm not saying Greta Thunberg's, I've banging the tin drum when the whole Nazi thing is going on. And since that's what she's doing, and because she's a child, they can't smear her, destroy her, yet. They can ridicule her and say, go back to school. And it's really odd, she's Nordic. I mean, they wouldn't allow, the nuns of Ireland or the fascists who control American academia would not allow something like this to happen. Then, I suppose, if I have one more, it's a rather controversial series of choices. If I can bundle them all together, there are the old left, sensible left, human rights activists, still knocking around the place. There's Geoffrey Robertson, Queen's Counsel, the head of Data History Journals, who's made a huge contribution. His writings and crimes against humanity and his public representations and his overall civic consciousness. There's even more famous Ralph Nader, the pioneering American environmentalist, unsafe at any speed, who has also been subject to constant campaigns of smearing because of his rather ascetic lifestyle. Those people who have traction and education and age and experience, who are not compromised within the human rights industry, they've got to take a leading role. In a sense, it's time and need for a kind of an alternative Davros group, an alternative Bilderberg group, a meeting of the true just in one room together, sharing information about the awfulness that's happened. I would include with a slightly younger version of that the Indian novelist Arunjata Roy, who's been heavily involved and jailed for her environmental activism in India and the effect of neoliberalism in destroying the social structure. There's a lot of interesting other people you could mention, but one has to be, I suppose, selective and keep it to that. Save one last unsettling thought, deeply unsettling, I think. I read a book by Roberto Saviano, who wrote Zero Dark 30. Sorry, not Zero Dark 30, who wrote Gomorrah, about the drug cartels in Italy. And he's written another book called 000, even more unsettling, which is how the mechanisms of the drug organizations and cartels, hierarchy, mafioso, command structures, have become replicated by corporate mentality. And the corporations and the transnational corporations behave like them, if not worse. And to some extent, so I think the reason I mentioned that at the end is all these very good people saying the important things about economic, environmental destruction, the need for equality, the pervasively unequal nature of our planet, which is getting worse and worse, the desire for public-private partnerships to rectify, the need for a revitalization of democracy when democracy doesn't exist. They're all up against these corporate transnational gangsters who are running the planet and the United States of America. So they may be appropriate adults, but what are they going to achieve?